Hello and welcome to video number 90 from Clydebridge station, and the video that we've got for you today is the latest in the sectors in detail. For the 40th anniversary of the launch of sectorisation on British Rail, I'm detailing each of the 5 BR business sectors, telling you what they were all about and giving you tips on how to model them. In the last edition of Sectors in Detail, we looked at Network South East, and if that business sector had all the big heavy commuter traffic in the home counties, then Intercity had all the glitz and glamour. Like the other 4 business sectors, Intercity was created on the 5th of January 1982, but the actual name Intercity goes back even further to 1966, when the London Midland region used the term Intercity for the electrified service between Wolverhampton, Birmingham and London, Euston. The London Midland region were therefore really the pioneers of Intercity, and it was somewhat appropriate that when the business sector of Intercity was created in 1982, that its headquarters should be at the London Midland region's main London terminus of Euston. Intercity was the one business sector that was completely countrywide in terms of passengers. Whilst it's true that Provincial, which we'll look at next, did operate into the Network South East territory, it didn't go into central London. Intercity did. It went as far north as Inverness, as far south as Penzance, as far west as Fishguard, and as far east as Aberdeen and Norwich. Intercity was the main long-distance high-speed passenger carrying sector of British Rail. It operated the 95 high-speed trains first developed in 1976. It was also the prime operator on the West Coast Main Line and East Coast Main Line, and it had a very, very big network indeed. So big, I can actually show you on this map here. I know that a lot of it is obscured, but this was actually taken from an East Coast train when it was getting refurbished, and you can actually see on there all the principal main intercity trunk routes there, with the other intercity routes in the thinner lines there. Out of sight, of course, there's further lines there. Intercity's livery, initial livery, was developed from that was used on the ill-fated advanced passenger train, the so-called executive livery. And that executive livery had the yellow cab sides at either end here on a 47 or an electric locomotive, with the word Intercity in Rail alphabet and the BR logo. On high-speed trains, as they were repainted, Intercity gave them the branding of Intercity 125, as they had been originally in blue and grey, but this time the Intercity 125 legend was in white rather than in the body colour. Intercity operated a vast number of trains and a vast number of stations, and for the 21st anniversary of Intercity in 1987, it adopted a new livery and became the first BR business sector not to use the BR logo. And it was this italic branding here with, as you can see there, a swallow. High-speed trains were actually also painted into this scheme as well, and there was no yellow along the cab sides on any rolling stock. This was also adopted for the AC locomotives on the West Coast Main Line, although initially a lot of them didn't have the swallow logo on them. It might not have been apparent, but Intercity was actually split into various subsectors. And when we're going to talk about modelling Intercity, it'll be important to talk about them as subsectors too. But there were a few subsectors. Intercity was obviously a nationwide business to the public eye, but in reality it was a lot more than that. Great Western operated out of London Paddington, and as the name suggests, was for all the intercity services on the former Great Western route out to Exeter, Plymouth, Penzance, Bristol, Cardiff, Swansea, Fishguard. Intercity West Coast operated out of Euston, though some services also operated out of Paddington, and it went to Coventry, Birmingham, Wolverhampton, Holyhead, Llandudno, Liverpool, Lime Street, Manchester, Preston, Carlisle, Glasgow Central, Edinburgh, and until the early 1990s, the Clansman was also run by Intercity West Coast all the way up to Inverness. The Midland Main Line of Intercity operated out of St Pancras, and it served Bedford, Leicester, Loughborough, Nottingham, Derby, Sheffield, Doncaster and Leeds. Intercity East Coast was the East Coast Main Line, and it ran from King's Cross Station to Peterborough, Grantham, Doncaster, Leeds, York, Hull, Northallerton, Darlington, Newcastle, Edinburgh, Glasgow, initially Queen Street but later Central when the East Coast Main Line was electrified in 1991 and Glasgow services were switched to Central, and northwards to Kirkcaldy, Dundee, Aberdeen, Perth and Inverness. The Highland Chieftain, launched in 1984, was an East Coast initiative extending a service that terminated Perth further towards the Highland capital, and in 2024 that service, should it still be running, will celebrate its 40th anniversary. Anglia and Gatwick operated out of Victoria and Liverpool Street, and it ran from Liverpool Street to Ipswich, Norwich and Great Yarmouth, and it also ran the Gatwick Express non-stop every 15 minutes between Victoria and Gatwick. Worth mentioning as well that when we talk about the modelling of that business sector, that subsector, sorry, I will actually deal with it as one. Then there was lastly cross-country. This was the services that didn't serve London, and especially the North East South West corridor. It ran from as far away as Aberdeen to Poole, Newcastle to Bristol Temple Meads, Glasgow to Penzance. There were all sorts of services, and Birmingham New Street became one of the main hubs for the Intercity cross country. It became a subsector in its own right in 1986, previously being under West Coast management. So that's an explanation of Intercity, what it was. Let's talk about how you model these trains. When we're talking about modelling Intercity trains, it's also easy to forget about the sleeper trains, and I will talk about them during it, and I'll deal with them separately. Each subsector of Intercity did at some point run duplicate trains, i.e. high-speed trains were seen on both the Great Western and the East Coast Main Line. When operating for the Great Western subsector or the Midland Main Line or the East Coast, or after 1991 they operated to Holyhead as well, these HSTs would have been in what were known as 2+8 formation. That's a power car at each end, 2 trailer firsts a buffet car and 5 trailer seconds. Strictly 4 trailer seconds and a trailer guard second, a TGS. Intercity cross country had 10 HSTs in the period that this layout is set, 1989 to 1990. Their HSTs were formed of 7 coaches, so it was a 2+7 formation. Now that 2+7 formation would have been 2 power cars, a trailer first, a buffet car, 4 trailer seconds and a trailer guard second, a TGS. Incidentally, in the early days of HSTs on the Great Western route, just inside the period we're modelling as well, some of them were formed as 2+7s, and they would have had 2 trailer firsts, a buffet car, 3 trailer seconds and a TGS. They were increased to 8 as a result of the introduction of the East Coast Mainline electrification, which rendered numerous HSTs surplus. And these HSTs would have actually been transferred to the Great Western as 2+8 or to the Midland Mainline, but also they would have some of them were transferred to cross country, and these ones on cross country would have had one of the trailer first taken out. That was converted to a trailer second and put into a 2+7 Great Western set. Mentioning the HSTs, of course, and I'm linked to the electrification of the East Coast Mainline, was that the Intercity power cars, 8 of them were converted to have buffers on them, and they were used for testing the Class 91s and were used in service with Class 91s on the King's Cross to Leeds route from the May 1989 timetable for about a year at the very most. As new Mark IV sets came on stream, these buffer fitted HST power cars were put back into normal service, and indeed when they were not required for use with a Class 91 they could be used as normal power cars. They operated on the East Coast route with the full Intercity Swallow livery, but with full yellow ends. Hornby has actually brought out a HST power car with buffers, and they've numbered it 43013. The only error with that they've made was that 43013 was the only one of the 8 buffer fitted power cars that had the holes and the shot lines around the former coupling box filled and painted, so to give a sort of smooth appearance. Hornby's not actually replicated that on their one, and they've done it like the other 7 buffer fitted power cars. That's actually not a bad thing in the sense that it makes it easier for you to renumber it to another HST buffer fitted power car. They were actually used, 2 of them, on the West Coast route initially from 1987 till mid-1988. 43014 and 43123 had the original executive livery, therefore strangely in the circumstances carrying Intercity 125 branding, but operating with a rake of coaches with a Class 86 at the northern end. When you're modelling HSTs in 2+8 formation with 2 trailer firsts, do remember that the trailer first coaches would always be at the London end of the train in normal service. The West Coast Mainline was pretty diverse when it came to rolling stock as well, and you would get from the Intercity sector locomotives in blue livery or Intercity executive livery or the Swallow livery. It was not uncommon though to find some locomotives in the BR Mainline livery like that, working Intercity trains for a period, and this was mainly the Class 90s for rail freight. Some of them appeared in Mainline livery. Inevitably, and this applies to the HSTs as well, there would be some mixed livery formations. Some would be blue and grey and some would be in Intercity livery, the coaching stock. The West Coast trains, like the HSTs, would always have the first class towards the London end of the train, and the guards van would also be towards the London end of the train on the West Coast locomotive hauled services. One thing to watch though when you're modelling the West Coast locomotive hauled trains is that sometimes likes of elderly locomotives, Class 81s and Class 85s, did haul them in normal service, and it wasn't unusual to find a mix of Mark 2s and 3s and sometimes Mark 1s on these services. The coming of the driving van trailers on the West Coast route from 1989 onwards led to what was called fixed formations, similar to the HSTs. As a result, what you would have is probably about 10 coaches with a loco and a DVT. So your formation would be from the northern end, locomotive, 6 or 7 trailer seconds. They could be Mark 2s or Mark 3s, a buffet car, 2 or 3 Mark 2s or 3s in first class, and a DVT at the rear. Hornby do make an Intercity Swallow livery DVT, which is just ideal, and Bachmann have recently brought out a Mark 1 BG in Intercity livery. Again, that is absolutely ideal. Sometimes Mark 2 BSOs would be used on the West Coast route as well. Do you remember as well, when you are modelling the local hauled trains, some of the Intercity livery coaches would have the real alphabet lettering, some, I don't know if you can just see that there, would have the swallow lettering. The Midland Main Line, when you're modelling it in that period, did have some HSTs, and some local hauled workings were undertaken by 47s. However, for some years the Class 45s were some of the mainstay on the St Pancras to Leicester Derby corridor, hauling it rolling stock as well. So you would actually find that Intercity trains would have a Class 45 at the front. The coming of more HSTs as a result of some service changes led to the gradual reduction in the number of Class 45s, and they were virtually eliminated from the Midland Main Line by 1988. 45106 was the last performer. It was withdrawn following fire damage in 1989 at Cricklewood Depot in London. The Midland Main Line HSTs would have the same formation as the East Coast and the Great Western HSTs. Of course, on the West Coast main line, their fixed formations were made a mixture of Mark 2s and Mark 3s, but on the East Coast main line, their fixed formations would start to differ from 1989 onwards with the coming of the Class 91s. Initially they hauled a dedicated rake of Intercity 125 stock with a buffer fitted power car at the rear. And of course the train would be Class 91, TGS, 4 TSs, a buffet car, 2 TFs and a buffer fitted power car at the rear. That's working from north to south. It was possible occasionally for a Class 91 to have to haul the set in the event of a TDM failure. When the Mark IV rolling stock started to be introduced, the first complete set was a Pullman set, and it had 3 second class coaches. There were 2 buffet cars and there was 4 other first class coaches, and that was a Pullman set. And there's an excellent photo that I've seen was of 91001 propelling up such a set back onto the main East Coast main line from Leeds. Of course, in normal service, the Intercity 225s had Class 91 at the northern end, 6 Mark 1s with 6 standard class accommodation, the Buffy car, and the 2 first class coaches with the DVT at the London end. The Class 91s did occasionally haul charters, and there's a video showing recently showing a Class 91 hauling a charter train with Blunt End first back into King's Cross, and a good old Class 47 hauling the going in to collect empty stock. Class 47s did occasionally make appearances on the East Coast Main Line, but from the mid-1980s it was mainly hauling specials, but they did occasionally have an odd passenger turn when the Class 89 was not available. And the Class 89 did actually work with Mark 4 stock in Swallow livery in a push-pull formation as well. Moving now to the Anglia and Gatwick. The Gatwick Express was created in 1984, and its formation had a Class 73 locomotive, later numbered from the 73201 to 12. This was because Intercity did not have a need for the diesel engine on the electro-diesel, but also they were given a higher speed than the standard Class 73/1s later on. In between would be 6 or 8 Mark 2s, which would have initially Rail Air Link Victoria Gatwick, but later Intercity Gatwick Express. And at the rear would be a Class 489 GLV Gatwick luggage van. This was basically a converted Class Southern Region 2 HAP driving car. The body side completely reprofiled and all the seating accommodation removed. It's a bit complex to go into the whole story of the Gatwick Express here, but I'll put a link to the Southern Railway email group which explains a bit more about the Gatwick Express. The London-Liverpool Street to Norwich axis used mainly Mark II stock with Mark 1 Buffy cars, and in fact Mark 1 Buffy cars were used on the West Coast route as well until the coming of some Mark III Buffy cars, both new build and also conversions from some surplus HST Buffy cars, where they went from 2 refreshment vehicles to 1. The London to Norwich service used Class 86s, and again it would have 2 the first class coaches towards the rear of the train, the London end of the train, the Buffy car, and 6 or 7 second class coaches. The guards van would either be at the London or the Norwich end. There was no hard and fast rule. The introduction of the Class 158 Sprinter trains to the Scottish Region network, ScotRail network, ousted the push-pull trains, and this led to the DBSOs being transferred to Intercity for the London-Liverpool Street to Norwich service. The DBSOs were completely reprofiled so that the corridor connection was removed, and this led to a full-width cab being installed, giving it a smooth front, but somehow it just didn't look right. But anyway, I digress. The DBSO would always be at the Norwich end of the train because it had standard class accommodation, with the locomotive at the London end of the train. Lastly, we have the cross-country. How do you model cross-country? Well, very simply, anything and everything went in the mid-1980s with Intercity cross-country. Their HSTs, of course, were 2+7 with 1 trailer coach and a Buffy car, 4 trailer seconds, and a TGS. But they were not the only performers on cross-country, because there used to be trains would join and divide at Carstairs station, and this would lead to formations of 11, 12, 13 coaches, sometimes hauled by a 47 or a 50, and the formations would normally be mixed livery. Things began to change a little bit on the subsector of cross-country in 1988. They needed a train that whilst unable to match the Intercity 125s for maximum 125 speed on routes where it was able to do so, or maybe 110 mile per hour running in other places, could still match the HST timings of the main 125 network. And computer simulations showed that a Class 47 on 6 coaches was able to do this. So if you see a Class 47 hauling just 6 coaches, that will be a cross-country train. Later on, as the sector started to settle down a bit more, and especially with the coming of the surplus HSTs and the ending of portion running, following the electrification of the East Coast Main Line, things got a little bit boring in a sense, I suppose, for the cross-country subsector. Locomotive hauled trains consisted of a Mark II BSO, 5 Mark II coaches, and there was this new Mark II Buffy car that was made up. It was basically like an old Mark II TF, but 2 seating bays were taken out and a toilet here to make a sort of Buffy car with some small microwaves. A larger version of a Mark II micro Buffy, if you so wish. Some of these occasionally did find use on West Coast Main Line trains. Locomotive changes always happened at Birmingham New Street from electric to diesel traction, by the way. And Birmingham New Street was a hotbed for the locomotive hauled fan, especially say with 47s or 50s taking over or replacing AC traction. The last type of train we'll have to talk about are, of course, the Intercity sleepers. Now here I've actually got a 3-coach one. This one is actually an ex-Lima example, but if you do go on various websites, such as eBay or various model shop websites, you may be able to pick up these Bachmann or Hornby ones. Bachmann have brought out a Mark I version, but that only operated until 1984. Intercity sleeper trains would have various formations. Most of them would be sleeping cars. They might have a Mark II BSO as here, or it might be a Mark I BG. And some of them did carry motor rail wagons as well. These are general utility vans. These would be in blue and grey, Intercity Executive, or this is Intercity Swallow version here. And if I just zoom that in a little bit, you can just see there the motor rail legend was painted on where the blackboard was. Motor rail wagons actually ran on daytime trains as well. And I'll talk about that just briefly in a moment. But the West Highland sleeper for the summer season did carry motor rail wagons, as did the Night Riviera sleeper out of London Paddington to Plymouth and Penzance. Seating accommodation was provided on the overnight sleepers. It would always be a Mark II, never a Mark III. Coaches would either be in blue and grey or Intercity Executive, and it would have the legend Intercity Sleeper on it. Later on, as it got refurbished and carried the Swallow branding, it would have the word Sleeper about here, next between the door and the toilet, and Intercity on there. I mentioned as well about motor rail, and there were some dedicated motor rail services that were run by British Rail in the 80s, and these fell under the intercity business sector. These would either use car flats, which could take 3 cars securely held together, or general utility vans. Operating on the West Coast line, they would be marshalled at the rear of a train going in either direction. If the train was a push-pull train, the locomotive would be sandwiched, if it was heading to London, or certainly going south, it would be sandwiched between the motor rail vans and the rolling stock. Occasionally, the locomotive would haul the train south with the DVT, and the vans would still be at the back of the train. If you're modelling motor rail and you want to actually include motor rail on your layout, you should try and develop a motor rail ramp like what I've done here, and you may also need a shunting locomotive too. Intercity stations had very limited branding to say that they were managed by Intercity, in complete contrast to regional railways in Network South East. Grantham had the Intercity signs at the ends of the platforms with Grantham in large lettering and Intercity in red joined up writing. But later on it was Intercity Swallow livery and Intercity Swallow logo, that would actually be applied to the signs at stations such as Wolverhampton and Reading to signify that they were managed by Intercity. Of course, Intercity trains were not always hauled by Intercity liveried locos. They might carry large logo livery, they might carry plain BR blue livery, or the main line livery, and it was not uncommon to see them being hauled by special liveried locos such as 47628 Sir Daniel Gooch. In fact, 47500 Great Western was allocated to Intercity, and was a regular performer on Intercity trains in its Great Western Railway 150 liveried. Rail freight liveried locos did occasionally haul trains as well. This was for the running in of the Class 90s for rail freight, or if there was a failure of a locomotive, a rail freight loco could take over. Some Network South East locomotives did haul Intercity trains, mainly on the Great Western main line, and normally just to cross-country services. Although at Ilford Depot in late 1989, I think over the festive period, there was actually availability of the Class 86 that ran on the London to Norwich service. Was at a low ebb, and so some Network South East livery Class 47s and some other diesel locos provided the power instead. Of course, Intercity depots and some Intercity stations had the ubiquitous Class 08 shunter. The 08673, along with one other, carried the executive livery, but they could just as easily have carried mainline livery or just the plain BR blue. Some of them did receive the later Swallow version, just simply the Swallow put onto the livery you see there. Intercity depots such as Norwich Crown Point would have had Intercity Crown Point depot on them, signifying they did belong to Intercity. Other such examples would include Palmady Depot in Glasgow, Craigentinny in Edinburgh, Heaton in Newcastle, and there were also Lera Depot in Plymouth were among the other Intercity depots. Intercity next year will have been around for a hell of a long time, and even though the name Intercity hasn't actually been used on the rail network for well over 25 years, people still talk about the trains being an Intercity train. So the name certainly hasn't been forgotten and probably never will. Intercity was a vast business sector and a very profitable business sector as well, and as I say, it had all the glitz and glamour, what with the HSTs and Intercity 225s, the Class 90s. It wasn't a really vast business sector, and in my opinion, Intercity Swallow livery was the best livery that a Class 47 ever carried. This one here, 47834 Firefly, actually it was one of the long range fuel tank fitted Class 47/4s. One last unusual Intercity train. Intercity didn't actually operate any electric or diesel multiple units per se, but it did own an electric multiple unit. I believe it was a Class 305 that had been made surplus on the Network South East services coming out of Liverpool Street when the Class 321s got introduced. Intercity took this and converted the train into a mobile classroom that would be hauled by a diesel locomotive to various points to train staff up during the electrification of the East Coast Main Line. And I've seen a photo of it stabled at Leeds Station, and it did visit various stations all up and down the East Coast Main Line, the main principal stations, and staff from other stations and depots would occasionally visit the classroom for getting instructions and getting taught things to do with the electrification of the East Coast Main Line. Not something that's ever been modelled, I have to say, but it would certainly be good to see that getting modelled. And as I say, it didn't actually operate from depot, from station to station or site to site under its own power. It was always hauled by a diesel locomotive. So that's the Intercity business sector. A sector that had all the glitz and glamour. A sector that had some of the best trains. A sector that went to quite a lot of places and then more, including Aberystwyth and Pwllheli. And in contrast to the other two passenger carrying sectors, the final sector that I'll be looking at is provincial or regional railways, originally entitled Other Provincial Services. And when we talk about that, you'll actually be surprised to learn that initially some of the services that it ran when it began in 1982, the rolling stock actually carried the Intercity name on them, but that's something I'll explain about later on. Now, the next video you're going to see from the layout will be the April 2022 update, which includes a little thing you can. I'm just going to put the camera just a little bit there, and you'll see something on the right hand side here, the very right hand side. I'll tell you more about that at the end of April. We'll see you soon for that. In the meantime, please take care of yourselves, happy modelling, and goodbye for now.